Web controls, validating user input. In this nugget, we're going to talk about the different ways that you've got to validate user input before you process it. And we'll start by discussing where you actually validate. You're going to do it on the client, on the server, or some combination of the two. We'll look at two of the built-in validation controls, a custom validator and a regex validator. We'll also talk about using jQuery in custom client-side validators. And we'll talk about validation groups, ways to have multiple sets of validation going on a single page. Let's start with a basic walkthrough here. I have created a fairly simple page with a text box, an enter button, a cancel button. I do have a regular expression validator and a label. So, let's look at the source first. I was going to run it first, but let's look at the source. So here's my text box where I want to type something in. Here's my enter button. What I want to happen is when the person clicks the enter button, I want to validate the input in the text box. Now there are three ways that you can do validation. One is completely client-side, meaning I don't have to submit the information to the server, let the server decide if it's valid, and then send the results back to the client. With client-side validation, all the validation happens intelligently in the web browser, which can be faster and more responsive for the user. It also means I don't have to worry about processing as much invalid data on my server. Server validation is going to do the opposite. It's going to require the entire page to be sent back to the server. The server validates it, and if it doesn't like it, it sends it back to the user, pre-populated with all the things they typed in, but displaying some kind of error message to tell them what they need to fix. And the third type is AJAX. And AJAX is kind of a combination between the two. AJAX, asynchronous Java and XML, is going to submit the value for validation to my server, but it's not going to submit the entire page. If my server likes it, it will tell the web browser that it's okay, and then the web browser can submit the entire page. If my server doesn't like it, it'll send back a very small response saying I didn't like it, and then an error message or something would be displayed at the client. So it allows you, AJAX is kind of the best of both worlds. It allows you to centralize your business logic on the server while still having a very responsive client page. So for this first example, I want to do client-side validation. Now I wanted to show you a couple of things. I've also created a second button, that's my cancel button. I don't want it to cause validation. If someone hits cancel, I just want to have the entire page submitted back to the server, and I'm going to do something else. I don't care if they've typed valid data or not. So I've added the causes validation equals false to this button's definition. Now to do my validation, I've added a regular expression validator. There are several different validators in the framework. A compare validator, which compares to value, custom validator, which we'll talk about in just a sec. Essentially what that does is it calls a predefined or a user-defined, a U-defined, a custom function to do the validation, and that would execute on the server. Range validator validates a range. Regular expression is the one I'm using, and required makes sure that a field is actually filled in. Now that's an important distinction. Although I do have a regular expression validator, it will not even attempt to validate the field if the field is empty. So I've told it to validate the text box. If the text box is empty, no validation will occur. If you want to make sure that there's something in the text box, you also have to add a required validator, indicating that the text box is a required field. So that's the control it's going to validate. I want it to do a static display. I want to enable client script. This is what's going to make my validation happen. This is what's going to make my validation happen client side as opposed to server side. When validation fails, this is the error message I want displayed, and here is my regular expression. It's a very simple regex for an IP address. So I've also got this label down here, and this is just so I can kind of show you what's going on. So let's look at the actual code behind here. If I click that cancel button, my label should say canceled without validation, meaning I submitted the page to the server and I did not bother doing any kind of validation. If I click the enter button, then I'm going to check the pages is valid property. Now, if you remember back in the nugget number 3, the page lifecycle, I talked about when you create a validator control, if it validates, it sets its own is valid property to true. All of the validators sum up to the page's is valid property. Meaning if I've got 10 validators and they all validated properly, then the page will have a true for is valid. So rather than checking each individual validator, I'm just going to see if all of them made it. And if it did, I'll pass back validated, otherwise I'll pass back not validated. So let's run this up. I'm going to start by just typing blah 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 something and hit cancel. Now you can see that my validator did run. You probably saw it flash over here, but it submitted to the server anyway and put canceled without validation because this did not require validation to occur. So now let's put in something and ask for validation. It does not look like an IP address. My label did not change, and that's because the page never went back to the server. The code behind for the enter button never ran. This ran entirely locally. If I put an IP address in here, that passes the validation, passes the page back to the server, and then runs the code behind, which is why I have validated here. In fact, about the only way I think I could get not validated to show up is if I delete that out entirely, hit enter. Now see, it's still going to validate because I didn't list this as being required. So in the code behind path I specified getting this to show up as not validated is technically not possible. Let's close the web app there and get back into design mode. Now I want you to at least see a custom validator, so let me chuck one of those in here real quick. There's a custom validator, so we're going to fill in an error message, did not validate. And we got to have a little bit more information in here now. We do need to specify the control to validate. We're going to set that to text box 1. And we are going to set the display to static, so it's just a static message. We have our error message. We could change the color of that to make it red, different font size, boldface, whatever. The big thing we need to specify is the on-server validate. So we'll specify validate me. Now that means I need to go into my code behind and I need to create that sub validate me. And it is going to, believe it or not, accept some inputs. Source as object, args as server, validate event args, correct. And there's my end sub. I've got a couple of things I can do. I'm just gonna, let's see, dim val as string equals args dot value. So that's the value that was typed into the text box. That's the value that we are attempting to validate. Let's just do something simple. If val equals 168.1.1, then args is valid is true, else args is valid equals false. So you can put whatever logic you want in here to validate whatever was typed in. You set is valid to true or false, whatever you're happy with, and that will return down to the control. Now these controls, these custom validators, because it requires this code behind file, are always going to happen server side, meaning the entire page is going to have to be submitted to the server in order for it to happen. In fact, let's just run this and I'll show it to you. I'm going to punch in something that's valid for my regex, but it's not valid for that custom validator. Now what should happen is my client-side regex validator will run. It will be happy with it. It will set its own is valid to true, but then it's going to submit the entire form to the server. Now that should hit my enter buttons code behind, and actually first it'll trigger validation. This should produce a not valid, and we should see a message come up over here from the custom validator when it gets posted back to the browser. Because the custom validator won't be valid, the page won't be valid, and we should now see not validated or something down here as our starting label. So let's hit enter, and it happened. So our custom validator did not validate. That was its error message. And then that in turn caused the page to have an is valid property of false, which led to this label server side being set to not validated. And then all of that got posted back to the client here. So You can have a combination of client and server-side validation. You want to do as much as possible in the client, I feel, but when it's too complex for that, then obviously you can do whatever you want on the server as well. Now, let's imagine a situation where you've created a page that has a login area for existing users and a registration area for new users. In other words, a user is going to fill out one or the other set. The login would probably be username and password. The registration might be username, password, and confirm password. Each of those areas will have a button, perhaps a login button and a registration button. You don't want to validate the set of controls that isn't being used by the user at that time. And so the way you can set all that up is with something called a validation group. So what you would do is in your validator, you would put validation group. Let's say this is the validation group for set 1. And let's say the custom validator is associated with something, well, let's say it's the same thing, validation group. I won't get too complicated here, set 1. So the idea is that only the validation group associated with the control that forced the thing to submit will actually be executed. And the way you usually submit is with a button, and so your buttons also have a validation group. So when someone clicks this button, these two validators will run because they're part of the same validation group. If I have other validators on the page, they will not execute. The page's isValid property will be set to true if all of the executed validators validate properly. In other words, just because there might be other validators on the page in a different validation group, they're not executing and they're not going to affect the outcome of the page's isValid method or property. Now, you probably remember how I told you just a little bit ago that this custom validator is going to run server-side, and the reason is because I have it set to use a server-based validation function. I could also, let's take that out, and I can add a client validation function. Now, this function is something I have to stick in here, so I would put in a script section, script type equals text/JavaScript, and within there I'm going to add my function validate me. Is that what I called the little dude? Yes. It is going to pass in sender and args, and maybe I'm just going to do a simple length check. args.isValid is going to be set equal to args.value.length being greater than or equal to, I don't know, 10. So very simple little function there. Will work perfectly to do what I need it to do. Now, it's become kind of popular recently to do this type of thing using jQuery. jQuery is an open source library. You can learn more about it at jQuery.com. It's a great library for quickly accessing things on the page, doing AJAX, stuff like that. So let's take a look at that. The first thing I'm going to have to do is make sure that the jQuery library is actually loaded. And if you look, when you create one of these projects by default, it does include the JS information in here. So all I'm going to do is come down in here into the head section, and I'm going to add a script source equals scripts slash jQuery-1.4.1.min, and the min version of this is actually just a minimized, so it's a little bit, it transfers a little bit more quickly. That's a text JavaScript, and there's our closing script tag. So let's get rid of that now. So that loads the jQuery library into this page so that I can actually start using it. Now I'm going to come in and use my same validator here. Yeah, we'll leave it in the validation group. Custom validator. This is a run at server. Got my error message. Control to validate. Display. Let's make display dynamic. And just for a second now, I'm going to take that out and this out, just so we can kind of simplify that down a little bit. This is our starting point. And I kind of wanted to do that because I'm going to make a little bit of a mess on my page here. Hit enter. I'm going to add the error message back in, error message. And I want to point out this time that you can actually put really complex messages in here. This is my error message. I can even put HTML tags in it. Let's take the old error message out. There we go. And make the green fuzzy go away. There it goes. So we're going to re-add our client validation function. And we'll call it validate me because I still have that function down there, so I might as well keep using it. I can still have a server-based validation if I want to. I can still put on server validate back in there. I'm not going to do that though. I'm just going to kind of leave this as it is. We'll wrap it right there. And so now I'm going to modify my validate function to use jQuery instead because I've loaded that library. So let's say I'm going to start by assuming that the validation is false. So we'll just set that as our sort of default. And the jQuery syntax looks something like this. I'm going to go grab the text box 1. That's going to allow me to, get the ID get the control that has the ID text box 1. So I just need to make sure that that matches that. So that's going to allow me to get to it. And then I can grab its text property or whatever else I want to do. I can do all of my validation, everything else. The neat thing here, you'll notice, is that I've not tied this custom validator to a specific control. It's going to execute as part of this validation set, but within this function, I can actually use jQuery to reference multiple other controls. For example, when you are, you've got 2 or 3 maybe password fields. You want someone to type a password and then confirm it. Within this custom validation function, I could access both of those using jQuery, which is a nice simple syntax, compare their values. If they match, set is valid to true, and then that'll make the custom validator return true, and it'll raise up to the page level and everything else. So it's a pretty neat technique to do. Another neat thing about using jQuery is that it provides a lot of options and makes it easier to use AJAX. So that if you want to pass a single value or a couple of values back to your server and have those validated server-side and then have a response come back, then it's very simple to do that. Now, we're not going to talk about jQuery AJAX until nugget number 12, but just when that time comes, remember that these custom validators are one place that you can stick in that sort of jQuery AJAX access. In this nugget, we looked at user input validation for web controls. We talked about where you might want to validate, server-side, client-side, or even using AJAX to do a combination of the two. We looked at the custom validator and regex validator controls. We talked about using those both client-side and server-side, and when you're doing so client-side, using jQuery as part of a custom validator. We also talked about validation groups, a way to have multiple sets of validation, only one of which will actually run at a given time. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you